Before I tell you how I turned my uncle's inheritance into a worthless plot of dirt, I need you to do something for me. If you've ever poured your soul into something only to watch someone else claim the credit, I need you to hit that like button. It helps to know I'm not just screaming into the void, that there are others out there who understand that some things, some legacies, are not for sale. Let me know I'm not alone in this fight. My name is Ainsley, and for 10 years the soil of Blackwood Estate was more a part of me than my own skin. The vineyard wasn't just a place of work, it was a living extension of my grandfather Arthur. He was a man who spoke the language of the earth, a dialect of minerals and rainfall that he taught to me, his willing apprentice. He'd hold a clump of soil in his palm, crumbling it between his fingers, and tell me its story. This patch is stubborn, he'd say, needs patience. That one over there is generous, but only if you ask it right. For a decade, I was the one asking. I was the one who listened when the vines whispered what they needed. I was the heart and the soul of the place. My Uncle Garrett, his son, only ever saw the balance sheets. He visited a few times a year, his city shoes always looking foolish and out of place on the dusty tracks. He'd walk through the rows of vines not with reverence, but with the cold, calculating gaze of an appraiser valuing an asset. He'd talk about optimizing yield and leveraging our brand, words that felt like profanity in the cathedral of nature. My grandfather and I had tended. He saw the grapes as units of production. I saw them as tiny, complex lives I was responsible for nurturing. When my grandfather passed, a profound silence fell over the vineyard. The wind and the leaves sounded different, lonelier. The grief was a physical weight, a stone in my chest, but beneath the grief, a cold tendril of fear had taken root. I knew my uncle. I knew his ambition was a hollow thing, devoid of the love and patience this land demanded. I knew he saw me not as family, not as the keeper of his father's legacy, but as a component, a highly effective, self-managing piece of human machinery that produced the award-winning wine he could then sell. The day his will was read confirmed every single one of my fears. We sat in a sterile, wood-paneled office downtown. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, and the kind of forced, funereal politeness that makes your skin crawl. The lawyer, a man whose face was a collection of joyless straight lines, read from the document in a monotone drone. I remember the words hitting me not as a sentence, but as individual, sharp-edged stones, and the entirety of the Blackwood Estate Company, including all land, property, and assets, I leave to my son Garrett Croft. I felt the air leave my lungs. My gaze drifted to Garrett, who was affecting a somber expression, but I saw it. I saw the tiny, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth. It was the ghost of a triumphant smile, quickly suppressed. He had won. The prize he had coveted, the asset he had waited for, was his. Then came the final twist of the knife. The lawyer cleared his throat and read the next line, a codicil that my grandfather must have added at Garrett's urging. A line meant to pin me in place, to chain me to my station. It is my sincere and final wish that my granddaughter, Ainsley Croft, continue in her role as head winemaker, ensuring the seamless continuation of the quality and legacy I have built. It wasn't a request, it was an expectation, notarized and sealed. I was an asset, just like the tractors and the bottling line. I was the quiet, hard-working winemaker, the golden goose, and he now owned the farm. Garrett placed a hand on my shoulder. It felt heavy, proprietary. He leaned in, his voice a low, condescending murmur meant to sound like comfort. "Don't you worry, Ainsley. Nothing has to change." My entire world tilted on its axis. 10 years of my life. 10 years of dirt under my nails and sun on my back. 10 years of whispering to the vines, of learning the subtle moods of the soil, of pouring my own soul into every bottle. It had all been reduced to a line item in an inheritance, a feature of the product my uncle now owned. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I think that's what unnerved him the most. He was prepared for hysterics, for a tearful, emotional scene he could manage with platitudes. Instead, I just looked at him, my expression a perfect, serene mask. Inside, a furnace had just ignited. A quiet heat was flushing up my neck, a feeling of cold, clarifying rage. I simply nodded. I understand, I said, my voice unnaturally calm. He couldn't read me, and it made him uneasy. He saw a quiet, hard-working woman. He saw his compliant winemaker. He didn't see the person my grandfather had actually raised. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that my grandfather had taught me more than just how to make wine. He had taught me how to cultivate things in secret. He had taught me how to be patient. And for the last 5 years, I had been cultivating something just for myself. A new grape hybrid, grown on a small, forgotten plot of land adjacent to the estate. A piece of land that I, and I alone, owned. All the prestigious restaurant contracts, all the gold medals, all the hushed, reverent articles in wine magazines about Blackwood's incredible new vintage. They weren't for Blackwood's tired old Cabernet. They were for my wine, my creation, my vintage. He thought he inherited the company. He was about to find out that he had inherited a hollow shell. He owned the land, but I, and I alone, owned the legacy, and I was about to show him the difference. I left the lawyer's office in a daze, moving through the city streets like a ghost. At the sounds of traffic and people were a dull, distant roar, a world away from the profound internal silence that had enveloped me. Garrett had tried to talk to me as we left. Something about a transition meeting on Monday, about his new vision. Ed just nodded. My mind a million miles away, my face an unreadable, placid mask. He wanted seamless. I would give him seamless. I didn't drive back to the main house, the beautiful old stone building that now felt like foreign territory. It was his house now. Instead, I turned my truck down a narrow, unmarked dirt track, one that was nearly invisible from the main road, obscured by a thicket of wild oaks. The truck bumped and jostled over the uneven ground, a familiar rhythm that did nothing to soothe the tremor in my hands. I parked at the crest of a small hill and got out. Before me was my sanctuary, my secret, a 3-acre plot of land the estate had written off decades ago as unarable. It was too rocky, too steep, too exposed to the wind. My grandfather had sold it to me 5 years ago for $1, a transaction we'd formalized with a notary in the nearby town, a quiet act of rebellion that no one else knew about. He'd called it my laboratory. Here, under the vast open sky, were my vines. They weren't the neat, orderly rows of the main estate. They were wilder, more tenacious, clinging to the rocky soil with a fierce determination that I felt mirrored my own. These were the Aura's vines, my creation, a hybrid I had spent half a decade developing through painstaking cross-pollination, grafting, and countless failures. A grape that was uniquely mine, a varietal that existed nowhere else on earth. I walked between the rows, the leaves brushing against my arms. Here, alone, with my true work surrounding me, the mask finally crumbled. The grief I had been holding back, the raw, searing pain of the betrayal, washed over me in a tidal wave. It wasn't just about the money or the ownership. It was the casual, brutal erasure of my life's work. It was the reduction of my sacred bond with my grandfather into a business transaction. He had left me to Garrett. He had handed his son the keys to my entire world, with a polite little note asking me to please keep the engine running for him. The tears came then, hot and silent. I sank to my knees, my hands digging into the familiar, gritty soil of my own land. The dirt was cool and real against my skin. This was mine. No lawyer, no will, no Garrett could take this from me. But the feeling of being orphaned, not by my grandfather's death, but by his final act, was a hollow ache that felt bottomless. How could he? How could the man who taught me to listen to the land not hear the silent plea of my heart? My mind spiraled backward, searching for an anchor, for a memory that made sense of this senseless act. I remembered being a child, trailing him through the vineyard, my small hand lost in his large, calloused one. He'd crouch down, pointing to a ladybug on a leaf, explaining its role in the delicate ecosystem. He taught me that everything had a purpose, even the smallest creature, the most stubborn weed. The land remembers, Ainsley, he'd say, his voice a low, gentle rumble. It remembers who tends to it, and it remembers who only walks upon it. His words were a comfort, but also a new source of pain. If the land remembered, did he? In his final days, had he forgotten the decade I had spent by his side? I thought of Garrett's visits, these brief, disruptive intrusions into our world. He'd arrive in a cloud of cologne and ambition, striding through the vineyard like a conquering general. He never asked about the soil's pH or the brix levels of the grapes. He asked about profit margins. He'd look at the gnarled 100-year-old Zinfandel vines my great-grandfather had planted, and see only inefficiency. I remember one particularly bitter argument. About 3 years ago, Garrett had come with a consultant, a slick young man with a PowerPoint presentation about maximizing output. They wanted to rip out the old vines, the very soul of Blackwood, and replace them with a high-yield, disease-resistant but utterly characterless clone. They wanted to automate irrigation, use chemical fertilizers, and cut the harvesting team by half. My grandfather, frail but still possessing a fire in his eyes, had listened in stony silence. I had stood beside him, my fists clenched, my arguments against their plan, a torrent of data and passion. I spoke of terroir, of the complex flavors that only came from old, deep-rooted vines, of the delicate balance we maintained. Garrett had waved a dismissive hand. Nice little hobby, Ainsley, but this is a business. We're leaving millions on the table. Arthur had risen slowly from his chair, his presence still commanding the room. He had looked at his son with a profound, weary sadness. You see grapes, Garrett, he'd said, his voice quiet but sharp as glass. She sees stories. You see profit. She sees a legacy. You will not tear out the heart of this place, not while I'm alive. The memory was a double-edged sword. He had defended me. He had seen me. So what changed? Was it the illness, the pressure from his only son in his final vulnerable months? The thought that he might have been coerced, that his final act was one of weakness rather than intent, was somehow more painful. It meant he had died believing he had failed to protect me. My thoughts then turned to the birth of Aura. It had started as an act of defiance after that very argument. How now Garrett's way of thinking would one day infect the vineyard. I needed something of my own, a lifeboat. I poured my meager savings into the unarable 3 acres next door. I spent my weekends, my evenings, any spare moment I had, clearing rocks by hand, building up the soil with organic compost, creating a haven. I started experimenting, using rootstock from a forgotten wild varietal I'd found at the edge of the property, and crossing it with a cutting of a fragrant, thin-skinned grape from a friend's vineyard in France. It was an obsession. For 2 years I had nothing but failure. The grafts wouldn't take. The few grapes that grew were bitter, acidic little bullets. Garrett would have seen it as a waste of time and money, but my grandfather saw it differently. He'd visit my secret plot, walking slowly among my struggling little vines. He never offered advice unless I asked. He just watched, a quiet pride in his eyes. This is how it begins, he told me one evening, as we watched the sunset paint the sky from my small hill, not with a bang, but with a single, stubborn root taking hold in a place no one believed it could. And then, in the 3rd year, it happened. A single vine produced a cluster of grapes, unlike anything I had ever seen. They were small, almost black, with a dusty, silvery bloom. When I crushed one between my fingers, the juice was intensely aromatic, a scent of dark cherry, violets, and something else, something wild and earthy I couldn't name. It was the scent of this specific, forgotten piece of land. It was the birth of Aura. To process this new grape, I couldn't use the main cellar. Garrett had access to all the records there. That's where my one true ally came in, Maria. She had been the cellar master at Blackwood for 30 years, starting when she was just a teenager working alongside my grandfather. She was a small, fierce woman with eyes that missed nothing, and a loyalty that was absolute. She had watched me grow up, had seen my devotion, and she harbored a deep, quiet disdain for Garrett's brand of corporate soullessness. I had brought her a basket of the first aura harvest in secret, feeling like a nervous child showing a drawing to a revered teacher. She'd examined the grapes, smelled them, tasted one, and then looked at me, a slow, knowing smile spreading across her face. "Your grandfather would be proud," she'd said. "He always said the best things grow in difficult soil." Together we became co-conspirators. We used an old, decommissioned fermentation tank in a forgotten corner of the cellar. We kept separate logs, handwritten in a coded shorthand only we understood. We aged the wine in a few old barrels I'd bought myself from a cooperative going out of business. It was our secret, a quiet rebellion, humming along right under Garrett's nose. When the first vintage was ready, we tasted it together. It was extraordinary. It was the story of that rocky hillside, captured in a bottle. Now, kneeling in that same dirt, the memory of Maria's steadfast belief was a small warm coal in the cold pit of my stomach. The fallout from the will was a storm, but I wasn't facing it alone. The resolution began to harden within me, crystallizing out of the chaos of my grief. This wasn't just about my personal pain anymore. It was about honoring the true legacy, the one of soil and soul, not of profits and power. I went back to the main house late that night, slipping in through a side door. I needed one last thing. I went to my grandfather's study, a room I had avoided since his passing. It still smelled of him, of old books and pipe tobacco. It was a fresh wave of grief, but I pushed through it. On his desk was a small locked wooden box. He had given me the key a year ago, just a few old papers, he'd said with a wink, for a rainy day. My hands trembled as I unlocked it. Inside there was no secret fortune, no revised will. There was something far more valuable. It was an old leather-bound journal, his personal garden log, and tucked inside the front cover was a thick envelope with my name on it. I opened it. The first thing I saw was the original notarized deed to my 3-acre plot, the one we had signed for $1, a solid legal proof of my ownership. Beneath it was a recent comprehensive soil analysis and terroir report for that very same plot, commissioned from a prestigious university lab. He had done it for me, in secret. He knew how special that land was. He had scientifically validated my hobby. And then there was the note. A single sheet of his familiar cream-colored stationery, his handwriting a little shakier than I remembered, but the words as strong as oak. "My dearest Ainsley," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the will has been read. I am sorry for the pain it will cause you. A man can be strong in his fields, but weak at his own table. My son is a force of nature, a storm I no longer have the strength to fight, but storms pass. What is rooted in good soil, what is tended with love, endures. I have left him the house, but I have given you the home. He may own the dirt, but you, my dear girl, you own the soul, and the soul always wins. Don't let him break you. Let him break himself against you. Your loving grandfather, Arthur." The stone in my chest dissolved. The confusion, the feeling of betrayal, it all vanished, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking clarity. This wasn't an act of abandonment. It was an act of faith. He hadn't left me unprotected. He had armed me. He had given me the one thing Garrett could never understand, and therefore never fight: a secret, a purpose, and the validation I needed to see it through. The tears that came now were not of grief, but of gratitude. The despair had burned away, leaving behind something cold, hard, and clear as diamond. My resolve. Garrett thought he was playing a corporate game of chess. He was about to find out I was the one who owned the board, the pieces, and the rule book. The quiet, hard-working winemaker was done being quiet. It was time to get to work. The plan had been forming in the back of my mind for years, a dormant blueprint waiting for the right catalyst. It wasn't a plan for revenge. I kept telling myself that. It was about correction. It was about restoring a natural balance that had been thrown violently out of alignment. My grandfather's note wasn't just a comfort. It was a mission statement. Let him break himself against you. That's exactly what I intended to do. He would be the storm, and I would be the rock. The foundation of my entire strategy rested on a simple legal truth I had established 5 years prior. The moment I bought my 3 acres, before I even planted the first vine, I had formed a limited liability company. I'd spent a few $100s on a legal website, filling out the forms for a shell corporation. I called it Aura Vintners LLC. It had no assets, no income, no employees. It was just a name, a legal fiction existing only in a state database, but it was a vessel, waiting to be filled. My land was purchased under that company's name. Every bag of fertilizer, every specialized pruning shear, every roll of trellising wire I bought for my secret project was purchased with a personal credit card, and the receipts were meticulously filed away in a box labeled Aura Vintners, Expenses. I was building a wall of paper, a fortress of documentation that separated my work from Blackwood estate. This was the first layer of my defense, the legal architecture. Garrett and his lawyers could argue that I developed the grape on company time, but I could prove that the land was never the company's, and the resources were all my own. It was a deliberately constructed gray area, just plausible enough to be a legal nightmare for him, but clear enough for me to defend. I knew enough about plant patents and intellectual property to know that the process was arcane and expensive, but ownership and documented creation were the bedrock of it all. I had that bedrock. It was a detail he would never have thought to investigate. To him, that rocky patch of land was just scenery. To me, it was my sovereign nation. The second, more important layer of the plan was the brand itself. This was the part that required the most subtlety, the most patience. For the past 2 years, as the Aura vintage began to prove itself, I handled every submission to competitions, every sample sent to critics and sommeliers, with surgical precision. The shipping boxes were from Blackwood estate. The cover letters were on Blackwood stationery, but the technical sheets, the official entry forms, the little tags on the bottles themselves, they all told a slightly different story. They listed the wine as Aura by Ainsley, and in the fine print under producer, it didn't say Blackwood estate. It said, produced and bottled for Blackwood estate by Aura Vintners. It was a quiet act of defiance, hidden in plain sight. No one ever questioned it. Why would they? The wine was magnificent. They just assumed it was some internal branding, a special project. They didn't realize they were signing contracts and awarding gold medals not to the estate, but to the specific, named vintage created by a specific person and a specific, legally distinct entity. Garrett saw the awards hanging on the wall of the tasting room, and saw validation for his inheritance. I saw legally binding, third-party proof of my singular ownership of its success, and that led to the third, and most powerful, layer of my leverage. The clients. Garrett saw them as customers of Blackwood. He was wrong. They were my clients. They were loyal to the art, not the institution. Chief among them was a man named Julian Thorne. Chef Julian Thorne was a culinary demigod. His restaurant in the city, the Gilded Table, had 3 Michelin stars and a waiting list a year long. He was notoriously mercurial, a perfectionist, whose approval could make a career. A year ago, I had gambled and sent him a bottle of the first proper Aura vintage, along with a handwritten note explaining the unique terroir of my small personal plot. A week later, he had shown up at the Vineyard, unannounced. He hadn't asked for Garrett, or for a tour. He had asked for me. We'd sat at a rustic table outside the cellar, and he'd poured himself a glass. He held it to the light. He swirled it. He inhaled its aroma for what felt like an eternity. He took one sip, closed his eyes, and was silent for a full minute. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Then he opened his eyes, and they were blazing with an intensity that startled me. "This wine," he'd said, his voice a low, serious hush. "Your wine. It is a revelation. It has a story. I design my menus around stories." He had proposed an exclusive contract on the spot. He wanted the entire allocation of Aura for his restaurant. The contract, which I now kept in a fireproof safe in my cottage, was very, very specific. It named the wine Aura and explicitly stated that the agreement was for the supply of this unique vintage personally overseen and produced by winemaker Ainsley Croft. It was tied to me and to the product only I could create. Julian hadn't bought a product from Blackwood Estate. He had entered into a partnership with me. Now, it was time to activate my allies. My first and most important call was to Maria. I met her at dawn in the chilly, damp air of the main cellar. The smell of aging wine, usually a comfort, now smelled like conspiracy. I laid out the whole situation: the will, Garrett's assumption of control, my grandfather's note, my LLC. I didn't have to ask for her loyalty. I could see the answer in her eyes before I finished speaking. Her face, usually a mask of calm competence, was set in a grim, satisfied line. Your grandfather was a great man, Ainsley, but he was a terrible judge of his own son, she said, wiping her hands on her apron. He always thought Garrett would come around, but a wolf is a wolf, even in a vineyard. What do you need? I need an inventory, I said, a real one. We need to know, down to the last bottle, what is Aura and what is Blackwood, and I need to know if the records are secure. She gave a short, sharp laugh. Garrett thinks the inventory is on the main server. He likes to look at the numbers from his phone. The real inventory, the one that matters, is in my head. And in this, she pulled a worn, leather-bound ledger from a hidden nook behind a row of barrels. Everything is here. Every bottle of Aura is logged, coded, and stored separately. As far as the official books are concerned, these racks are empty, awaiting new stock. He owns a cellar full of mediocre Cabernet and a computer full of lies. The relief was immense. Maria was more than an ally. She was the keeper of the keys. She knew the physical reality of the business, the ground truth that Garrett, with his obsession with digital spreadsheets, would never see. I'm starting my own company, I told her. For real this time. Aura Vintners. It won't be big, not at first, but it will be ours. I want you to be my operations manager. She didn't hesitate for a second. Just tell me when, she said, a fierce, protective glint in her eye. This place without you is just a factory. We both know it. It's time we reminded everyone what this is really about. This isn't just wine, she added, patting the cool, dark bottle of arresting Aura vintage. This is ammunition. Leaving the cellar that morning, I felt a shift in the air. The grief was still there, a quiet hum beneath the surface, but it was now overlaid with a powerful, driving sense of purpose. I walked back to my little cottage on the edge of the property, the one that came with my job, but now felt like a temporary outpost in enemy territory. I sat at my small kitchen table and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. At the top I wrote a quote from my grandfather's note: "Let him break himself against you." Beneath it, I started to sketch out the sequence of events. The steps were simple, quiet, and devastating. No shouting matches, no dramatic confrontations. This would be a quiet coup, executed with the precision of a winemaker tending her vines. Garrett was about to host his first strategy meeting as the new owner. He was expecting to lay out his new vision for the future. He had no idea I was about to unveil the true nature of the past. I took a deep breath. My internal monologue was a steady, calming rhythm. It wasn't about revenge. It was about legacy. It wasn't about destruction. It was about creation. The will had been a mistake, a typo in the story of our family, and I was simply the editor, making the necessary corrections. The plan was in place. The fortress was built. My allies were ready. All I had to do now was wait for him to make the first move. I knew I wouldn't have to wait long. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. It was Garrett's new assistant, a young woman who sounded perpetually flustered. "Mr. Croft requests your presence at a mandatory strategy meeting tomorrow morning at 9. In the main house conference room, her voice was clipped and formal, a reflection of the new corporate chill that had settled over the estate. "Of course," I said, my own voice calm and even. "I'll be there." The next morning, I walked into the conference room that had once been my grandfather's library. The warm, book-lined walls and worn leather chairs were the same, but the feeling was utterly different. Garrett had replaced the old rustic oak table with a slab of black, sterile glass. He sat at its head, looking every bit the conquering CEO in a crisp, expensive shirt. Two other men were with him, strangers in suits who looked like they'd been summoned from the same generic corporate catalog as the table. They were his new consultants, his turnaround team. He started the meeting without any preamble, his tone brisk and self-important. He spoke of streamlining operations, of aggressive marketing, of a new era of profitability for Blackwood Estate. He used a laser pointer to highlight charts on a screen, graphs that showed projected growth based on the recent awards and accolades. My awards, my accolades. I sat there, silent, sipping a glass of water, my face a carefully composed mask of professional interest. I let him talk, let him build his entire fantasy on a foundation of sand. Finally, he turned to me, a magnanimous, patronizing smile on his face. "And Ainsley," he said, gesturing toward me as if presenting a prized racehorse, "our master artist. To achieve these projections, we need to scale up production of the Aura vintage. Immediately. I need you to document the full process, the exact blend, the fermentation timelines, every detail. We need to create a standardized recipe that our other cellar hands can replicate. We're going to make it the flagship of the new Blackwood brand." The two suits nodded in agreement, their faces lit with the dull gleam of people who see only numbers. This was the moment, the precipice. My heart gave a single hard thud against my ribs, and then a profound, icy calm settled over me. I took a slow sip of water, placed the glass down deliberately, and met his gaze. "That's not possible," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the corporate jargon like a scythe. Garrett's smile faltered. He gave a short, sharp laugh, as if I'd made a joke. "What do you mean, not possible? You created it, didn't you? It's not magic. It's a process. We just need to bottle that process." "It's not possible," I repeated, my voice still level because Aura isn't a Blackwood Estate product. It never has been. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The two consultants exchanged confused, uneasy glances. Garrett's face, which had been a mask of confident ownership, began to crumble. The blood drained from it, leaving a pale, mottled canvas of disbelief. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice losing its baritone command. "The awards, the contracts, they're all for Blackwood." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply let his confusion hang in the air. I let him scramble, his mind racing to catch up with a reality he had never bothered to investigate. I had given him the simple, devastating truth. The rest he would have to discover for himself. "I need 24 hours to consider your proposal," I said, using the kind of detached corporate language he loved. I stood up, my movements measured and calm. Then I turned and walked out of the room, leaving him sputtering in a vortex of his own making. I didn't go back to my cottage. I went directly to the small makeshift office I had set up in a spare room there. I sat down at my laptop. My hands were perfectly steady. I opened a new email, to Garrett Croft, subject, resignation. The body of the email was just as brief. "Dear Garrett, please accept this email as formal notification of my resignation from my position as head winemaker at Blackwood Estate, effective immediately. Sincerely, Ainsley Croft." I hit send without a moment's hesitation. A weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. The chain was broken. Then, I opened a second email. I pulled up a carefully curated contact list. Chef Julian Thorne, the top sommeliers in 3 major cities, the distributors who had been clamoring for more Aura, the critics who had written glowing reviews. It was a list of about 20 names, the 20 people who mattered. Subject: Aura Vintners. The harvest continues. The email was as simple and profound as I could make it. The soil has changed, but the vine remains. Aura's next vintage is ready for allocation. A new chapter begins. More details to follow. Ainsley Croft, Founder, Aura Vintners. I attached a single high-resolution photo, a bottle of Aura, gleaming in the evening sun, with the rows of my own stubborn vines stretching out behind it. Then, I hit send. The die was cast. It was a silent declaration of war, delivered not with a cannon blast, but with a whisper. The immediate aftermath was a deafening silence. For the rest of the day there were no calls, no angry emails, no frantic pounding on my cottage door. It was the eerie calm before a storm, and I used the time to make my final preparations with Maria. We coordinated the logistics of moving the entire stock of Aura wine off the property, a move we planned to execute under the cover of darkness. The first tremor of the earthquake I had triggered came via a text from Maria late that night. It was a photo of Garrett, standing in the cellar, his phone pressed to his ear, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. The text read, "He's been on the phone for an hour, yelling. Something about the Gilded Table reservation system being down." I smiled. The Gilded Table didn't have a reservation system tied to Blackwood. They had a direct ordering portal with me, which I had just deactivated. The next text came 10 minutes later. Now he's screaming about a product code mismatch. He can't find Aura in the inventory system. He thinks the server crashed. Of course he couldn't find it. It didn't exist in his world. It only existed in Maria's handwritten ledger, which was now safely in the front seat of my truck. He was a ghost hunter, searching for a spirit that had never inhabited his house. The full force of the panic hit him the next morning. I know this because the first call I received was from Chef Julian Thorne himself. "Ainsley," he said, his voice a low, amused rumble. "I just had a most illuminating conversation with a very flustered man named Garrett Croft. He seemed to be under the impression that our contract was with him. I corrected his misunderstanding. He did not take it well." "What did you tell him?" I asked, a knot of nervous excitement tightening in my stomach. "I told him my contract was for a specific vintage, from a specific winemaker, whose name was Ainsley Croft. I told him that without you and without Aura, Blackwood Estate is of no more interest to me than any other mediocre vineyard. I told him our business relationship was terminated, effective immediately." There was a pause. Then he added, "So, about that new vintage. When can I expect my first shipment from Aura Vintners?" The calls and emails started flooding in after that. One by one, the clients I had emailed responded. Some were confused, asking for clarification. Most, however, understood immediately. They weren't buying a label, they were buying my work. My name and the name Aura's were the brand, not Blackwood. Within 48 hours, every single prestigious contract Garrett had seen on his PowerPoint slides had evaporated from his grasp and reappeared in my inbox. The public reveal, the final, devastating blow, came on Monday. A friend of mine, a well-respected journalist for the industry's most read trade publication, ran a story. I had given her the exclusive. The headline was plastered across the front page of their website. "Ainsley Croft, star winemaker of Blackwood, launches independent label Aura Vintners, securing exclusive contracts with the Gilded Table and other culinary giants." The article was a masterpiece. It told the story of the unique grape hybrid I had personally developed over 5 years, on my own private, once unarable plot of land. It painted me as a visionary, an artisan who was striking out on her own to protect the integrity of her creation. It didn't mention Garrett by name, but it didn't have to. The implication was clear and utterly humiliating. The celebrated success of Blackwood Estate had just walked out the door, and the entire industry now knew that the emperor had no clothes. Garrett hadn't just inherited a company, he had inherited a public relations nightmare. The silent takeover was complete. The kingdom was his, but the crown, the jewels, and the entire treasury were now mine. The power shift was not a slow, grinding process. It was a sudden, seismic event, like a dam breaking. The trade journal article acted as a flare, illuminating the new landscape for everyone to see. My phone didn't stop ringing. Distributors who had previously dealt with Blackwood's sales team were now calling my personal cell, bypassing the old channels entirely. They didn't want the standard Cabernet or the bland Chardonnay. They wanted aura. And they knew I was the only person on the planet who could sell it to them. It was an exodus. The entire top tier of Blackwood's client base, the source of all its prestige and a significant portion of its projected revenue, defected in a matter of days. They weren't just canceling orders. They were sending emails, which Maria gleefully forwarded to me, explicitly stating that their business was with Ainsley Croft, and they would be following her to her new venture. It was a cascade of loyalty I had quietly built over a decade, and it was paying dividends in the most spectacular way. I set up a temporary headquarters in a small, rented office space in the nearby town. It was nothing more than a couple of desks and a coffee machine, but it felt more real, more powerful, than the grandest room at the Blackwood estate. It was mine. Maria, who had resigned the day after I did, was there beside me, fielding calls and organizing logistics, with the calm efficiency of a field marshal. We were a two-woman army, dismantling an empire with a telephone and a laptop. Then came Garrett's desperate counterattack. It was as predictable as it was pathetic. He tried to fight on two fronts, the legal and the emotional. Both failed spectacularly. First, the lawyer's letter arrived. It was a thick, intimidating packet of paper, full of blustering threats and legal jargon. It was a cease and desist order, accusing me of intellectual property theft, of developing the Aura grape using Blackwood estate resources, and on company time. It demanded I immediately stop all sales and turn over all existing stock of Aura wine. I had been waiting for this. I simply forwarded the letter to the lawyer I had hired weeks ago, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who specialized in agricultural IP. Her response was a thing of beauty. It was a quiet, surgical strike. She sent back a package containing a certified copy of the deed to my land, legally registered to Aura Vintners, LLC. She included the articles of incorporation for my company, dated 5 years ago. She attached copies of my personal credit card statements, highlighting the purchases of vines, equipment, and barrels. The pièce de résistance was the sworn affidavit from Maria, attesting that she had witnessed me working on my personal plot on my own time for years, and that all Aura fermentation and aging was done using my privately purchased equipment. The final page was a polite but razor-sharp inquiry, asking if Mr. Croft would like to proceed to a discovery phase, where his own lack of involvement or investment in the Aura project would be subject to sworn depositions. The legal threat vanished. We never heard from his lawyer again. It was a bluff, and my quiet, meticulous preparation had called it perfectly. This is where I know some people watching will say the law isn't that simple, that plant patents are complex, and they're right. But in a battle of narratives, a well-documented story beats a hollow threat every single time. He had a theory, I had receipts. With his legal guns silenced, he resorted to his final weapon, a pathetic, desperate appeal. He showed up at my new office one evening, unannounced. The confident, arrogant CEO was gone. In his place was a haggard, desperate man, his expensive suit looking rumpled, his eyes holding a frantic, pleading light. "Ainsley," he began, his voice strained. "We need to talk. This has gone too far." I remained seated behind my simple desk, my hands folded calmly on its surface. I just listened. He launched into a rambling, incoherent speech about legacy, about family, about what our grandfather would have wanted. He tried to invoke the memory of the man he had so thoroughly disrespected. "Your grandfather wouldn't have wanted this, Ainsley. He wouldn't have wanted to see his life's work torn apart. That was a mistake. Using my grandfather against me was the one thing I could not tolerate. My grandfather," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "wanted the soul of this vineyard to endure. You tried to turn it into a factory." He flinched as if I'd struck him. He switched tactics, moving from emotional manipulation to bargaining. "Hey, look," he said, leaning forward, placing his hands on my desk. "I was wrong. I was arrogant. Hey, see that now? Let's fix this. A partnership, 50-50. We'll create a subsidiary for Aura under the Blackwood umbrella. You'll have full creative control. Just come back. We can't let this legacy die. It was almost comical. He was standing in the headquarters of my thriving new company, a company built on the very asset he was trying to bargain for, and offering to sell me back a piece of what was already mine. He was trying to buy back the prestige he had lost, the prestige I had created. He still didn't get it. He still thought it was something that could be bought or sold. I looked at him, a man so thoroughly defeated by his own ignorance. There was no anger left, just a kind of sad, final clarity. I thought of a moment years ago, when he'd seen me tending my first, struggling vines on my rocky plot and laughed. I remembered his exact words, and I used them against him. "It's a nice little hobby, Garrett," I said softly, "and it's served me well, but it's not for sale." His face fell. The last flicker of hope in his eyes died out. He stared at me, finally understanding the chasm that separated us. He saw a competitor he couldn't buy, a force he couldn't intimidate. He finally saw me, not as his compliant winemaker, but as the person who held all the cards. The power had not just shifted, it had been wholly and irrevocably transferred. He had nothing left to offer me that I hadn't already built for myself. The end for Garrett was not a dramatic, fiery explosion, but a quiet, inevitable collapse. A house with a rotten foundation doesn't need a demolition team. It just needs a strong gust of wind. My departure was that gust. Weeks after our final, pathetic meeting, Maria came into the office, a grim but satisfied look on her face. She'd heard from one of her old contacts in the Blackwood accounting department. The news was exactly what we expected. Garrett, in his infinite arrogance, had taken out a substantial business loan immediately after inheriting the company. The loan was secured against the Vineyard's future earnings, projections based entirely on the lucrative contracts for Aura wine. With those contracts gone, the Vineyard's value plummeted overnight. The bank, seeing that their investment was now secured by an asset worth a fraction of its former value, had called in the loan. Garrett couldn't pay. He had no cash flow, no prestige clients, and a cellar full of wine that the market now viewed as second-rate. He was insolvent. The bank, or whatever board of investors he had, forced him out. There was no golden parachute, no graceful exit. He was unceremoniously removed from the position he had coveted for so long. The last I heard, the bank was selling off Blackwood estate for pennies on the dollar, piece by piece. The land, the equipment, the buildings, the name itself, Blackwood Estate, was now worthless, a brand publicly associated with failure and hollow promises. It was an off-screen, unceremonious end, a quiet dissolving of a man's greed. It wasn't my revenge that undid him. It was the simple, brutal arithmetic of his own incompetence. My final confrontation with him was not in a boardroom or an office, but in my own memory. I replayed that last conversation, his desperate plea for a partnership, and I finally allowed myself the quiet satisfaction of the victory. I had not just survived, I had prevailed on my own terms. He had tried to use my grandfather's memory as a weapon, a final, desperate gambit, and it had failed because he never understood the man. He never understood the lessons Arthur had taught me. I stood on my own land, the land he had dismissed as worthless, and I looked at the rows of Aura vines, their leaves rustling in the breeze. They were strong, resilient, and thriving in difficult soil, just like me. I remembered something my grandfather had told me once, as we stood in that very spot. We were looking back at the main estate, a beautiful picture in the distance. He had gestured toward it, and then put his hand on my shoulder. "The land remembers who tends to it, Ainsley. That land over there, it knows my name. It knows your name." He'd paused, his gaze sad for a moment. "But this land," he said, sweeping his hand over my small rocky plot, "this land is different. This land only knows you." That was my final word to Garrett, delivered in the silence of my own vindicated heart. That land, his inheritance, it didn't know his name. It never would. The ultimate vindication came a few months later. It wasn't a headline or a contract. It was a quiet evening. I was hosting a dinner for my new team and our key partners. We weren't in a stuffy restaurant or a formal dining room. The table was set between the rows of my Aura vines, right on the crest of the hill on my own property. String lights were woven through the trellises, casting a warm golden glow. Maria was there, her face alight with a joy I hadn't seen in years. Chef Julian Thorne was there, laughing and arguing with my new distributor about flavor profiles. My small team of cellar hands, all of whom had left Blackwood to join me, were there with their families. We were a small group, a collection of people, bound not by a corporate structure, but by a shared belief in quality and integrity. I stood at the head of the table and raised my glass. It was filled with the newest vintage of Aura, a wine that tasted of resilience and hope. Looking at the faces around me, bathed in the warm light, surrounded by the life that I had cultivated with my own 2 hands, I felt a sense of peace that was more profound than any victory. I hadn't just won a battle. I had created a new world, a new reality that was built on the values my grandfather had instilled in me. I was not a component in someone else's machine. I was the architect of my own. I had reclaimed my past, and in doing so, had built a future that was more beautiful and more deeply satisfying than I had ever imagined. Garrett had inherited a company. I had built a home. Today, my office isn't in a grand old house. It's a small, light-filled room that looks out over my vines. On the wall, there isn't a long list of corporate mission statements. There are just 2 things framed side by side. On one side is the simple $1 deed to this land, the quiet promise my grandfather made to me. On the other is the first gold medal that Aura ever won. Between them, on a small shelf, sits a single dusty bottle of that first vintage, a monument not to a product, but to a process. It's a shrine to foresight, to patience, and to the unbreakable power of a legacy that you earn, not inherit. Garrett inherited the buildings, the tractors, the tired old vines. He inherited a shell, but he never understood the one fundamental lesson my grandfather tried to teach us both. A legacy isn't a line item in a will. It's not something you can acquire. It's something you build, day by day, with your own 2 hands, in soil that you have earned the right to tend. It's the trust you cultivate, the integrity you maintain, the story you create, and that's the real takeaway here. For anyone watching who has ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or erased in their own life, they can own your desk. They can own the company you work for. They can put their name on your report. But they can never, ever own your talent. They can't own your relationships. They can't own your integrity. That is your true inalienable property. That is the one asset that no one can ever take from you. Your name, your work, your soul. That is the real legacy. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight to protect your own legacy, then please, do me a favor and hit that like button. It truly helps to know that these stories matter. Leave a comment below and tell me about the legacy that you are building for yourself, brick by brick. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that their true value can't be signed away by somebody else. And finally, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, so you and I can continue to share these stories of vindication and empowerment together. Thank you for listening.